welcome back, everyone. It takes a lot of commitment to come back after lunch, so we really appreciate this. And we hope to be up to the level of the previous sessions, because those were very, very engaging and very informative sessions, where we covered, as you know, what happens in government-held areas, what happens in opposition-held areas, and now we go to a very, very complex area in the northeast of Syria where so many things happen. And I am very, very happy to be here. My name is Tamara Al-Rifai. My background is human rights and humanitarian aid, and I am sharing this brilliant panel with three brilliant researchers and experts. Asad Ashi, who's originally an economist and economist turned activist turned head of Beitna Syria. Rana Khalaf, a researcher and an expert on governance, civil society, trying to link policy practitioners and the academia, which is a very difficult and very needed job. And Hayed, one of my favorite researchers, someone I absolutely enjoy reading papers by and educate myself on issues of military, security, the Kurds, and ISIS, which brings us to our session today, which is ISIS, that black hole that operated in various parts of Syria, concentrating in the northeast before being ousted, or at least before its caliphate being dismantled, thanks to the international coalition. But the questions of what happens after the caliphate have emerged very, very quickly, especially considering the massive destructions in the north of Syria, considering the massive displacement of population, which has heavily affected the nature of this region, a region that is extremely diverse originally. So even before all these operations, diverse ethnically, diverse in structure, diverse in access to resources, oil, gas, water. This area is famous for oil and gas, but it's also a repository of Syria's two largest dams, so it's a huge resource. We will discuss the new power dynamics that have emerged after the departure of ISIS, where we will discuss these dynamics at both at the local level, so at the level of people, how people have tried to fill the space vacated by ISIS, but also at the level of relations with sources of authority, external authority or local authority, relations with the Kurds, relations with Turkey, relations with the coalition even, because we're going to talk about the armed groups. So it is a very, very, very complex area with many factors at play. So without further ado, a quick reminder that this session is on the record, like all sessions today. And if you want to promote any of your friends sitting at the panel, I mean the panelists, please tweet about them using hashtag CHSyria. And thank you so much, Chatham House, for hosting us all, being among the like-minded Syrians, all very concerned about what will the future of Syria be. So I would like to ask both Asad and Rana, who has replaced ISIS? Who has replaced ISIS in Deir ez-Zor? And for Deir ez-Zor, I want to hear from Asad. And then who has replaced ISIS in both Rojava and Raqqa? And then I'm going to turn to Rana. Asad, it's yours.
Well, thank you very much, Tamara, and thank you very much for Chatham House for hosting us. The quick answer to your question is no one and everyone, especially when we're talking about Deir ez-Zor. When we see the power dynamics in Deir ez-Zor, they have been very similar, whether Deir ez-Zor was under control of the regime or when it went to the hand of the opposition for a short while, then Nusra, then Daesh, and now in the hand of Majlis Deir ez-Zor, the Deir ez-Zor Council, which is an affiliate of the Syrian Democratic Forces, the Syrian Democratic Council. But what we shouldn't forget as well when we talk about Deir ez-Zor is that Deir ez-Zor at the moment is divided roughly along the Euphrates River, the east of the Euphrates River being under the control of the Syrian Democratic Forces, and the west of the Euphrates being under control of the Syrian government, or Syrian, and more likely the Syrian government allies and Syrian government related militias, mainly Iranian or local. And there, the power dynamics are mainly controlled by the tribes. We all heard about the famous Shaitat tribe, for example, and what happened to them, and what ISIS did to them to be able to take control of Deir ez-Zor. And on the flip side, you have obviously the Baggara and Sheikh Nawaf al-Bashir, who basically just trying now to represent the pro-government forces within the tribal functions of the area. The Majlis Deir ez-Zor itself, the Deir ez-Zor Council, affiliated to the Syrian Democratic Forces, is also formed of different tribes, including members of the Shaitat themselves who kind of defected from, if I may use the word, from the Syrian opposition and moved and joined the Syrian Democratic Forces. So, in short, SDF, but not SDF as we know it in the northeast of the country. It's not neither the Raqqa or Manbij model. It's a third model that is very local and that has not settled at all. So that's why I said no one and everyone.
Still fluctuating. Rana, moving to you, what are the local governance dynamics in other parts? So not in Deir ez-Zor, because as Asad said, Deir ez-Zor is a very localized and very specific example. What have you noticed?
Okay, so when we're speaking about governance, and we're not just speaking about military control, we usually shift to whichever military actor controls a certain area. Now, different areas display different dynamics. And yes, majorly it is led by the PYD, you call it SDF, but the PYD is the main political actor, the YPG is, and the YPJ is the armed group. But then we have other groups. So within it, it has its own structures. So I will speak about the groups and then the structures. So we do still have civil resistance, and I will give some examples. And you have local tribes and patronage systems. You have the regime, much as we like to think that the regime is not present in different ways. There is a presence of certain institutions, certain ways, for instance, the salaries. So we have all these actors in place now. Is it homogeneous across the areas where the PYD has the highest authority? No. There's a big difference between Hasaka, where we see the state capture in a way and the creation of parallel structures in some ways, cooperation and competition between regime PYD, and then moving to Manbij. And here I'd like to compare again. They're very similar, and there's big differences between Arab majority areas and Kurdish majority areas. But the way the PYD governs, the first thing it tries to secure is security on the ground. So yes, we have the military council and we have an executive council, and then we see the very localized level until recently, where there has been a lot of assassinations, both in Manbij and in Raqqa for senior people in key positions. They're controlling the internal security. They have traffic security. They have social security. So we see security at different levels, anti-terrorist security. And then managing security on the ground, they have communes, councils, and under these, they have different forms and structures to manage services. But here again, and for instance, let me give some examples of civil resistance, for instance. There was some pressure in Manbij for army conscription. And this is where we see strikes by the people from Manbij. So yes, we don't like to focus on the daily lives of people. Usually it's all the news which areas are hit. But these local everyday dynamics are important to see how life is negotiated and managed. And then the further you go, and even the tribal structures are different. And where the PYD would enforce its army conscription or not, this depends on how strong or weak those structures are. Patronage systems are important too, how legitimate the actors are. So, for instance, we look at the competition between the regime and the PYD in Manbij. And if you look at the schooling, and so basically now, even I've heard that key personnel within the PYD are sending their kids to private schools, which is the regime's curriculum, because it's the only one that's accredited. Eventually, yes, they did Kurdish language school, but what next? So again, we see here the competition, and the minute they did it, the regime withdrew salaries from the. So those very details can tell us a lot about the relationships. Now, Raqqa, I think, and again, it tells us about the legitimacy and the local dynamics. Raqqa, I think it's very, very early time to judge how, especially, we tend to focus too much sometimes on local councils as if they're the entire legitimate governance structure, but I've been looking more recently at the Mukhtar, who manages actually the coupons, the provision of services in Raqqa, the discounted, what do you say, coupon for food stuff?
The
coupon,
vouchers.
Vouchers, exactly. So again, it's this, not the local council. The local council, there has been some private organizations, implementers like Creative, trying to implement certain projects, but more or less it's very minor in terms of humanitarian kitchen. So again, the dynamics really different. And then there are the international actors, which we cannot totally ignore. So if we look at INGOs, INGOs in Manbij and INGOs in Raqqa, and these really shift the power dynamics, because by their very existence and through going through the relief and development agency of the PYD, by definition, it is legitimizing a governance actor in place. In Raqqa, what's even more interesting is this dependency on private implementers, be it through, again, you call them Creative, etc. And even the Russians are now using private, the Wagner, which is private contracted security providers. And later on, I will explain how this impacts the relationships on the ground between the people when you have a private actor coming to just provide a service and then go. Maybe I'll stop it here.
Okay, because I wanna hand it over to you, Hayat, precisely where Rana left it, on the day-to-day life of people in Raqqa. What is it like? We've seen the devastation on TV, we've seen the destruction, we've heard about the landmines, and we've heard about entire neighborhoods being completely emptied by their people because everyone is in displacement camps. What is it like today?
Mm-hmm. Well, unfortunately, not much happened even after, like now we are talking about more than 6 months almost after the city was captured or recaptured from ISIS. Many people still cannot go back to their homes for many reasons. You mentioned the level of destruction, especially when we talk about the city itself. In the countryside, it's a bit less, because the level of fighting was mainly focusing on the city, street fighting and stuff like that. So the level of destruction is preventing many people from going back there. As you mentioned, mines, and this is one of the main issues. When in the past 2 weeks, I've been talking to people in Raqqa, and they all have been saying the same. Like, okay, we need water and electricity, but the main concern and priority right now is to be able to demine our homes. And the problem here is that the level of investment provided by different international agencies and governments is that first, they are only focusing, some of them are focusing on specific areas. The second one is that they don't have the capacity, there is still no willingness to invest in that and demand. This is what happened now. If you want to see the rest of Raqqa being demined, it will take years and years and years. And this is why people there are trying to look for locals who are brave enough and desperate enough to basically demine themselves. So I will pay you in order to go and demine my house. And the problem is that most of them will be killed and will be carried out by the next one who will try to come and clean it. So mines is a major issue. The second one is related to the power dynamics and political actors, which is the uncertainty about what will happen in Raqqa. First of all, many people, or some people, it depends on who you ask, they are scared of what might happen if they go back to those areas and live under the SDF or the PYD control. Others are scared that the regime will try soon to take back those areas, whether through a deal with the SDF forces or basically by force. So they don't want to go through the same circle of violence over and over again. This is why they're waiting to see what will happen. So the uncertainty about the future, the political future of the area and who will control it is a big issue. Lack of services, as I said, no one is interested in doing that. Basically, many of those people, even who are going back, are staying in IDP areas, and the situation there is really, really bad. No food, nothing, and even if they want to leave those camps, they have to get permission, and many of them are not able to get that permission. So as soon as they get permission, they will go back, even if that means that they will basically be at risk of being killed by a mine or something else. The last issue here is basically that governance. When we talk about the Raqqa Civilian Council, it has not been able to do its job for many levels, for many reasons, sorry. The first reason is because they don't have the resources. They are not. No one is interested in funding reconstruction in that area. The second one is that because people don't view them as legitimate actors. So many people there, even who stayed there and didn't move to other areas, they're saying that we are not willing to give them legitimacy, and we will not take part of that because we know that we will not have power over basically the decisions that are taking place there. For them, the cadre and the YPG are the ones who are taking those decisions. And the last one is basically related to the fact that even when you look, Rana has been talking about the formal power structure in that area. In the past 2 weeks, I've been looking at the informal power structure in the area, and what's the relationship between this informal power structure and the formal power structure. And the problem is that, although I have to mention this, the SDF has been trying to talk to different tribal leaders, influential figures. They have not been able to win them over. So what they are doing right now is to replace them with other people who are willing to join this structure. And this is why people are not happy with that.
And who are those people?
People who are willing to do that. We start with like basically the top leaders of tribes and stuff like that, and they would be like, no, we're not taking part in this. So they will go for like second, basically those who are like second or third or fourth. Sometimes they bring people from outside the city, like the head of. So the head of the legislative council of Raqqa is from Kobani, which is first of all is a different province, and second of all, it's 150 kilometers away from this, and he's Kurdish, he's not Arab. So for them, these are really important issues. I'll stop here, and then we talk about the rest later.
Well, I wanna take a quick look at something you also just mentioned and give you that question, Asad. You mentioned legitimate actors, or the question of who is seen as a legitimate actor today, who is seen as someone who is capable of representing a population that is facing some political vacuum, right? In the earlier sessions, we looked at legitimate actors or actors that are perceived to be legitimate as those who either provide services, so they detain a kind of authority over people through the provision of services, or those who have arms, and so they have military power over those they govern. I want to ask you, Asad, in relation to Deir ez-Zor, because it's such a complex place where you have many layers, you have the military, you have the governance, you have the resources, and you have new dynamics that also will morph around access to resources and the ability to sell gas and oil and sell resources. How do you see the role of the armed groups that are still in Deir ez-Zor, and the relation to those who will be able to control access to resources?
Well, again, looking at Deir ez-Zor, we cannot avoid the comparing east and west of the river. So I'll focus a bit on the east of the river. That's mainly the Syrian Democratic Forces, at about 60% to 65% Arab, so from the neighborhood, from the locality, and they're the ones pretty much calling the shot there on the ground in terms of military action. However, the decisions very much in that area are being taken at the international coalition level. So unlike Raqqa, and unlike the northeast of Syria, generally speaking, the east of Syria, and Deir ez-Zor more specifically, has been very much an area under direct control of the international coalition because of the battle, well, not the battle, but because of the confrontation with Iran. One of the reasons why I believe we have a strong presence and a strong interest of the international coalition in Deir ez-Zor is to basically try to stop that corridor that is running from Tehran all the way to Beirut today. And that explains that, plus, obviously, as you mentioned, the battle for resources. And I'll get to that in a second. But more on the armed actors, you see them very much acting in coordination, always with air cover from the international coalition and direct orders, which is slightly different than how the YPG is presenting itself in the northeast of the country. Moving very quickly to the resource question and how they relate to resources. Most of Syria's oil at the moment is in that area. Most of it is in Deir ez-Zor, but you have some as well, and the sweeter crude is in the northeast of the country, and what is referred to, and I'm going to go a bit technical, as the Swediya crude, which is the benchmark crude for Syria. It's in the northeast of the country, in the Meylan. That is a completely different story to what we see today in Deir ez-Zor. Meylan, that's under YPG control, that's under the PYD structure, and it's very much a separate story. I'm going to focus on the main field in Deir ez-Zor, the Amar field. That was basically the subject of a recent battle by the Wagner that Rana mentioned, who tried to cross the river, access the Conoco gas plant, which treats the gas coming out of the Amar field. And we had a direct strike from the US, from the international coalition, that assumably killed more than 100 Russian mercenaries. So we can see as well the dynamics in that area being defined by the battle for resources, oil being one, gas to a lesser extent. I'm going to explain why. Because the main gas in Syria, as Jihad was mentioning in the government session, is in the Palmerites. It's the old Ebla gas project that produces about 1 BCF of gas per day, whereas the Conoco gas plant, which is in the SDF area, produces about half a BCF of gas a day. So it's not as interesting as controlling and ensuring control of the Palmerites. And anyway, on gas, there is no way to take it. So basically, SDF or whomever is controlling that gas plant has only two choices. Either flare it, which the regime used to do from 1990 until the Conoco gas plant was built. They used to flare that gas. Or pump it into the national gas grid lines. They don't have a third choice. With the oil, and that's where there might be some leverage, you actually can have other markets to look at, other interesting markets to look at. One of them, the most obvious of them, but the most challenging at the same time, is obviously Turkey. It's challenging.
So how will the Kurds do business with
Turkey? That's where the challenge comes, is how do you basically ensure that there is some form of relationship, modus operandi established between the Kurds and the YPG, the PYD more specifically, and the Turkish government to facilitate that flow of oil. We saw a model of that in KRG, and eventually most of the fields in KRG in the Kurdistan region of Iraq were linked to the Ceyhan port in southern Turkey. So it is possible. Unfortunately, it's going to cost a lot, because at the moment there are no pipelines that connect Syrian oil to Turkey. The pipelines only exist either to the two refineries in the east of the country, in the west of the country, Banias and Homs, or there are pipelines that go to Iraq. That's the other option. It's to look at the Iraqi option, but that means basically asserting some leverage over the Iraqi government so that revenues basically go to the whatever power structure exists in the east of the country and not to the central government in Damascus. And it will require a certain form of investment, because it will require reversing the flow of the pipelines that exist. Right now, the pipelines actually pump from Kirkuk and Mosul into that T4, the famous T4 connection, and onwards to the Mediterranean Sea. What it would require is a small investment to reverse the flow and basically pump it the other way around. It's feasible, but it will require a moderate investment. So in short, without the last thing, sorry, I wanted to mention about resources when it comes to oil and gas is that most of these wells that we're talking about, whether in Umar and also to a lesser degree in Rumaylan, were plugged in around 2012, 2013 because of the oil and gas sanctions that were imposed on the Syrian government back then. Unplugging them, they were temporarily shut, so they were not permanently
Plugged.
blocked. Okay, plugged, not blocked. Plugged. Well,
Okay.
sorry,
I'm just
I've
assuming
gone-
that not all
yeah,
of
I've
us
gone-
are gas experts.
Right. So
gas and oil experts. Safely assuming.
basically, once you dig a well, and you start producing oil, there is no way you can stop the oil from production unless you plug that
Okay.
well. So you basically stop the flow
Okay.
of the oil
Okay.
coming up. And you can do, there are two procedures. You either permanently shut down, what they call permanently shut down the well, and that's you kill it, or you temporarily plug it. It's basically cementing. You use
Okay,
cement
okay.
basically to stop the flow for it. So unplugging these wells will require as well a certain level of investments to bring up operations again. And as Sinan was mentioning, the Umar field has been heavily damaged because of the international coalition bombardment into the area. The last thing, very quickly on resources is water. As you mentioned, the two largest dams in Syria are under control of SDF at the moment. They're not in the Deir ez-Zor area. They're in the Raqqa area. You have the Euphrates Dam, which is the largest one in Tabqa, and you have the Tishrin Dam in the south of Manbij. These two dams obviously produce a lot of Syria's electricity, and especially the Euphrates Dam is heavily damaged, where the control room was completely destroyed by the international coalition as well. And I don't see there how much leverage the international coalition will have, because these two are Soviet-built dams, and unless the international coalition is willing to make a huge investment to completely redesign and re-engineer those dams, these dams will have to go back to Russian control, let's say, if I may put it that way.
Great. So in terms of agency, or in terms of being able to determine what the Syrians want, which is something that Rana and I were discussing earlier, we still have a long way to go in that very complex region. Now, with all the difficulties you mentioned, I almost think that my next question is an easy one. It's to Haid. Having committed or initiated all this damage, I'm talking about ISIS, so initiated the damage and inviting the international response to it, which has left us where we are today. Where is ISIS? I mean, is the threat completely gone? You know, we speak about dismantling the state itself, the Islamic State, but the state isn't just a concept. It's made up of people, and until recently, they were accounted for. Where are they?
And you consider that an easy question, right?
Well, I thought after the oil and gas, I might as well engage with you on something slightly less complex.
Well, for many countries who are involved directly in the anti-ISIS campaigns, they have already started declaring victory. Many of them, they said, we won, and now they are basically changing their policy or adopting their Syria policy accordingly. Unfortunately, they are not taking into consideration two main issues. The first one, I'm talking about general, and then I will come into the details. They don't take into consideration two main issues. The first one is that ISIS is only a symptom of the Syrian conflict, is not the cause of the Syrian conflict. And this is something that people forget when they talk about ISIS and fighting ISIS. So as long as the conflict is there, and as long as the root causes of the problem are not basically addressed, we will not be able to get rid of ISIS and like-minded groups. This is important to highlight. The second one is that they also think that defeating the group militarily will automatically erase the ideology that the group has been able to basically circulate or enforce on many people for years in those areas, and mainly kids here who don't know anything about this ideology. So that is another issue. When it comes to what happened to ISIS fighters, not much is clear on this. We know a few things. The first one is that thousands of ISIS fighters were captured by locals. I'm talking about roughly around 4,000 fighters, Syrian fighters, who were captured by SDF forces. That's according to local officials. On top of that, you have 500 foreign fighters who were captured there from almost 40 different countries. So those are who are being captured. This is the first category. The second category is those who try to escape either to Turkey and other places, basically to leave Syria and go elsewhere, or to go to other areas that are where ISIS still exists, the small pockets here and there that ISIS still exists in and fights from. So this is the second one. The third one is that those who changed hats, so they were ISIS yesterday and today they are part of the SDF or even sometimes part of different militias that are fighting with the regime. So they just changed hats, and this is not only limited, this phenomenon is not limited to this. Those who were Ba'athis before joined Free Syrian Army, and this joined Nusra, joined ISIS,
Which
and
is
now...
what we mentioned in the earlier session about the rebel groups and how you can shift
Exactly.
allegiance very easily for pragmatic reasons.
Exactly. So those are the third one, basically those who still have power but under a different title. So the problems, we have two main problems here, the short-term problem and the long-term problem. The short-term problem that the SDF officials have right now is how first to secure those detention centers, collective detention centers, where those ISIS fighters and their families are basically kept in. And this is one of the main issues because there is no, they don't have detention facilities that are secured. And this is why a few days ago we heard about few people who were able to escape. The problem here is that this means that other breakouts will most likely happen in the future. The second problem they have is they don't have basically specialized law in order to prosecute those people. And this is something that related to what Brenna was talking about before. So there's no local courts that has the capacity to basically process those people. There's no lawyers, there's no manpower, and on top of that, they don't have a law because they are trying to establish their own entity, but they are not there yet, so they don't know what to do with that. On top of those issues, that basically the Western countries in general are not willing to take back their citizens. So they're saying they're there, we don't want to deal with them, keep them there. And the problem is that locals there don't know what to do with them because even if they will basically use the basically constitution or the law of that is provided by the Syrian regime, it will be difficult to apply that on those people because they're from a different nationality. So this is another issue. The long-term one, just quickly jump to that, is how to deal with those people who basically detaining them is not enough, and you cannot do that for years and years. So at some point you have to find a solution, and that solution is not there. How to reintegrate those people and basically rehabilitate them in order to be able to allow them to go back to the communities and be accepted and be active as well there. And there is no basically strategy here. The only thing that the SDF has been doing for some time is that they have been releasing some fighters, 100 here, 100 there, and they're saying that we are doing that in order to basically strengthen the ties with local communities, and those people who were released were they were released upon request from their tribes. So we are trying to use the tribes in order to create this reconciliation process, but this is not helping because first of all there is no follow-up mechanism in order to make sure that they will not go back to ISIS. It's creating tension because many of those people committed crimes and they didn't face a fair trial. And another issue is related to the fact that what Assad was talking about before, this is the last thing, I promise you, that what Assad was talking about before was that you have, especially in Deir ez-Zor, where you have many people controlling that area at the same time, no one is controlling that area. the format I would use, or the term I will use in order to refer to that format is basically an areas of influence, islands of influence, let's put it this way. Those islands of influence mean that there is a huge, basically, vacuum in between them, and that will allow ISIS to re-emerge, especially that their ideology is not being challenged on the community level rather than on the individual level. And I will end here.
Well, interesting, bring it back to the community level and bring it back to the reactions by the community. So I want to ask the three of you a last question by which I wrap up our conversation and open it up to the rest of the people here, which is a question on, okay, a lot of things went wrong with the ISIS story. So from its inception to the response to it, to the coalition, the coalition response to what happens after we've bombed the hell out of one place and decimated ISIS, what happens after that. So a lot of things went wrong. If you could tell me the one thing that from your different perspectives went completely wrong, and from a policy level you would make a policy call to anyone who's able to influence policy on post-ISIS areas, what would it be? Rana, I want to start with you.
Okay. Basically, the entire framing of the Syrian conflict. So when you were talking, Hayed, and I was thinking how this whole discourse about the war on terrorism was used against ISIS. It's used by the Turks against the PYD. It was used by the regime against the people. The regime described people as viruses. What do you do with a virus? You terminate it. You dehumanize the other, and then the focus is on the actor. And this overtly focus on the actor rather than the discourse, than the system, is by itself problematic and self-defeating. So that framing is problematic. And then if we're looking, because I always look at those pillars, most of non-state armed actors, not only in Syria, they engage in service provision. Mm-hmm. So service provision and security provision is part of it, but legitimacy is not only about this. But then again, let me take you to security provision. So the framing of the international community, what now the US is doing is, okay, security on the ground, let's have a strong, this is how states were created, in monopoly of violence. So we're as the US, we're extremely happy with the YPG, and let them control, they're excellent, they're disciplined, which is, they have the highest discipline amongst the other group. So let them bring that security, full stop. And then we bring, there are actually 3 private organizations working on demining in Al-Raqqa. So again, and this whole private way of securing security on the ground. But let's look at it from a local perspective. What does security to the people mean? Why did people not return? How do they perceive their security on a daily life? And I'm talking here, what we need to follow is not those incidents that are on the news. The daily life is something that happens every day, and that's not on the news, and that creates a system of security and insecurity. So let's think of it more in terms of human security, that security of the people, and the psychological security, what they feel, are they secure enough to come back or not, and how do they perceive it on the ground?
Do we know? Did we ask? Does the international community engage enough? Do humanitarians and those who are thinking of reconstruction policy, do they engage enough with the people?
Usually what they do is they create a police on the ground, and usually the police are the ex-military, so they engage more in abuses, and it's usually the powerful actors who takes over. So, and this takes me to this, just 2 more points.
No, one more.
I have to.
One more.
Services, the idea of how services are perceived as if services is everything. So we look at, let civil society provide those services, and we start treating them like a project. So, okay, let do X, Y, Z, engage in reconstruction. So that's problematic, and there's an over-obsession with institutions. And when we're just too focused on institutions, the obsession is with the state. with the UN working with the state as an instrument, and then we forget the agency of the people on the ground, those relationships. And that's what I'm speaking about when I say legitimacy. It's things that you cannot, how do you measure trust? How do you measure how people engage with each other? Why do you call it a patronage system? It might not necessarily be. It's just a form of maintaining security. And this draws us back to why certain actors are legitimized and certain actors are not. So all I'm saying is, beyond this framing of what we think of as a business model, a business project of dealing with institutions and working with institutions, they're important too, but we need to look at those agencies. For instance, when supporting civil society, look at social movements, fund these. These are important, not the English, not necessarily just the English-speaking ones who are very good at writing. But you don't, because you say they're not vetting, we're not going to risk it. And the end of the day.
I actually want to move to you with that point, especially with your most recent, in the last few years, your most recent professional experience of managing Beitna and looking very closely at the role of civil society. What is your policy recommendation?
Well, that's a hard one on this area specifically. Let me first try to answer the question of what went wrong. What's the single point that went wrong the most? And I would say
Well, mostly my question was, what's the point that you would make? Not,
right, yeah.
You know, let's construct.
Right, yeah, absolutely. But post-conflict planning, yeah. I think went completely south. Especially when you look at, Deir ez-Zor, Raqqa, and beyond. Let's not forget that when we talk about post-ISIS, it's not just the northeast of the country, but it's also some parts of the northwest. I mean, you have the Turkish experience in the Euphrates Shield that we haven't addressed, but that's another model that exists, and that's another problem as well. The fact that you have different models and different competing models today for a post-ISIS model, whether it's in Deir ez-Zor and its format, the northeast of the country and its format, or Turkey and what Turkey is trying to call its post-ISIS model. So this competition is really unhealthy between the three. It's driving inconsistencies among the different areas, and it is leading to further fragmentation and further division within the country itself, to a point where we're all starting to ask ourselves, well, how do you put this all together yet again? And that's where would be my policy recommendation, is whenever we're trying to think of governance, well, I mean, obviously, I absolutely understand, Donna, that there's this obsession about institutional building and institutions, etc. But unfortunately, it's done the wrong way. No one is trying to think of governance when we're talking about governance in a holistic model. How are we going to basically, once we're starting to establish some form of governance in these areas, make sure that this will eventually be amalgamable, that you can basically, out of this, create a full, put the country back together, or basically say that we're working on a de facto partition, and that's how it would be, and then invest in that. That's the biggest problem, and that's the big problem as well in Idlib. And then unfortunately, if the international coalition is not going to start looking at reconstruction, and here I'm going to use the taboo word of reconstruction, if we're not going to invest enough in Raqqa to make sure that Raqqa is stabilized, not only Raqqa, I mean the whole area, Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor, and Raqqa is stabilized and becomes a model to envy, basically, then we're going to see the fate of Idlib. Idlib was that's my projection at least, Idlib was at one moment very promising.
Yeah, on its way out.
On its way out, when we had a lot of investments from the international community, etc. And then suddenly we said, well, it's not working, we're giving up. And HDS appeared. Well, unfortunately, if there won't be significant amount of investments in the northeast of the country and in the east more generally, there is a big chance ISIS will appear.
Hi, on this happy note, what's your comment?
Yeah, I'll make you proud. I'll give you 3 concrete recommendations, because the other 2 were a bit making troubles rather than... No.
And the man not interrupted the woman. The woman.
Guilty. So 3 main recommendations. The first one is how to deal with basically the governance structure in Raqqa. Many countries, especially the EU, different EU countries, they have a problem with dealing with the SDF affiliate, basically council there, and they say we don't want to upset Turkey. I understand their concern. No, I understand the concern. So that basically what they are doing wrong right now is that because of that, they are not doing anything. And I think there is halfway, basically, there is a middle ground here, which is to work with few, what they call their jam'iyat, which are local, basically, technocrats who are working together in order to rebuild their areas. And this is a very successful project. And most of those jam'iyat are not working through the local council, basically the Raqqa Civilian Council. They are being contracted directly by different international NGOs, even governments. So I would say that, first of all, we have to invest more in there, as I said, but I'm also giving you a model how to do that without basically getting into trouble with either basically Turkey or other actors. So this is one important issue, and within this, I think it's important to highlight, to focus on two issues. Demining, this is really, really important, and the other one is humanitarian aid, including water and electricity. Those are two issues. Moving to the second one is reintegration, and this is, I talked about it, but I think what we need here to start looking at is a model where we can work on reintegrating and those not only fighters and members, but basically those who had suffered enough under this ideology, and now they're the victims. They are not the perpetrators. This is, for me, the kids especially, and this is the only thing they know. So we need to look at not rehabilitating those people on the individual level alone, which is important, but on the community level. And this is something we are not seeing, neither the individual level nor the community level. Moving on to the last recommendation, which is what to do with the local governance structure in Raqqa. And I don't think that you can do much with it, but at the same time, you cannot basically just say, you don't have the power to overthrow it. So what I'm saying here is to look at alternatives in order to give locals real agency within this system. If this is not applicable, then I'm not sure what other ways to do, but this is one issue in order to basically be pushing, because the Americans and other countries have not been looking into this yet. How to make sure that locals have some sort of power over how to run their areas directly. And the model that is being implemented right now is not like that. I'm just putting people there, and the decisions are making elsewhere. So within this basically framework of reconciliation, or basically working on improving the structures, we have to work on basically another issue that goes hand in hand, which is to work on this division between Arabs and Kurds. And everyone has been talking about this since morning. I think we should also start looking at, we have been focusing on how to basically peace talks, negotiations on the basically political level at the national level. But we need to talk about these kind of processes on the community level, and we have to basically name the problems and start addressing them. So far, we have been avoiding talking about them. I'll end here. Thank you.
And let's all wait for the Israeli model. That's
I knew you were going to throw this in. I
Let's
knew
all
it.
wait for the Israeli model in the Yarmouk Basin and see what's going to happen there. And that will give us yet another example of what can be done post-ISIS.
So with this, I would like to open the floor for interventions, discussions. Again, the same. Please just state your name and your affiliation, and I'm going to try to cover as much ground, since we're talking military terms, as I can.
Afternoon. Martin Hetherington from the Foreign Office, but anything I say will be in a personal capacity if we're on the record. Thank you for this and for the earlier sessions. It's really, really interesting. I had two questions. I think Hyde actually answered one of my questions, because I was going to talk about how you move on governance from Raqqa and how you make it more diverse. So I would be interested for Rana and Assad to kind of pick up on Hyde's last point and sort of make any comments on that. And then going back to something that, Rana, you said in both at the beginning, you came back to in the end, and that is about this sort of institutions, and you touched on at the beginning about how the state and how the regime still has sort of power and influence into the networks. And this is not just on a kind of bureaucratic level in sort of things like education and health and elsewhere, but it's also in some of the economic ties. And, are the positive things on that we should be working with? Because, I mean, obviously I accept your points that we should be working on a community level and we should be involving people, but we also need to make sure that we're not destroying state structures. And there may be links within regime and kind of, all of Syria networks on a bureaucratic and an institutional level that we should be trying to support and not weaken. And then just a quick sort of comment on the demining. We are doing demining, and so is the US. It's not my project, but I mean, I think as far as I understand, we are doing stuff on the ground at the moment, and it includes training the trainers. So hopefully there will be more locals doing it.
I have to say that it's not nearly enough.
Yeah, I mean, there's always more you can do, I accept.
Yeah, but here we're talking about more than more.
Right, Rana, you have 1 minute, and then Asad 1 minute. Okay, Asad.
Well, the approaches like what that were tried elsewhere, trying to create a rapprochement, let's say, between the two different main governance structures in Raqqa today, the one sponsored by the International Coalition being the Raqqa City Council, and the one being sponsored by Turkey being the Raqqa Provincial Council, failed. I mean, that didn't work. So I think we need to move beyond this trying to reconciliate RCC, RCP, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We need to try to, as Hayat and Rana both said, try to come with something that is grassroots, that comes from the locals themselves, and try to establish that under this umbrella, and try to put enough pressure on the SDF structures, on the International Coalition's allies, basically, to allow for that grassroots process to emerge and create its own local structure. But we tried the top-down approach by creating a joint committee between RCC and RCP, and it didn't work. So I don't think we should invest any more time into that.
Rana?
I think key here is minding the kind of institutions that are being supported. I'm not anti-institutions, and I'm not totally pro dividing the grassroots from this level. But all I'm saying is, if they could be made to be a little bit more representative, for instance, in Raqqa, what we find is they're basically, even in Manbij, figureheads. And even in Manbij, one of the figureheads is at least linked to the regime. So again, here we see the links increasing. So what we can do, and it's not about dividing it by, the head of the tribe, who doesn't necessarily have the power anyways, and reinforcing those power structure. Sometimes a school teacher has very high representation and legitimacy, key leaders in the community, and this is how we challenge the power structure. And I think that's what I've been trying to talk about, rather than reinforcing the same problematic power structure that will recreate the same problems.
Just quickly to add to what my colleagues were saying, I think there are different ways to do that. But what I want to highlight here is that there is big, basically, opportunity right now to do that. I've been talking to different officials within the Raqqa Council, and they are suffering because they have no resources. So this is the right time to step in and say that, okay, we will help you, but we have conditions, and those conditions should be met in order for us to work together. But this is the right time to do it. If you wait another year or two, the situation will be completely different, and this is why it's urgent right now. Or it's quite possible to do.
Next, the lady, and then the gentleman.
Hi, Abigail Watson from Remote Warfare Programme. I wondered, going back to the lessons learned and what went wrong, I wonder how the West, especially when choosing partners, were there mistakes made, or were the ambiguities that the Obama administration tried to keep, particularly with the Kurds, were they essential to tackle ISIS, or could that have been done better?
Sorry, I didn't get the question.
Yeah, I didn't
Oh,
get the
sorry.
question.
So when the West was choosing partners to fight ISIS, and when it tried to maintain the ambiguities to work with the Kurds, was that the only way it could have done it, or could it have done better?
you want me to answer it now? Okay. I think it could have been done in a different way for many reasons. I cannot talk about it here in detail, but the main problem is that there is no one actor that can fight ISIS all over Syria and be popular at the same time. And this is why you need to work with local forces. And this is not the model that the Americans basically followed. What they did is that they found a strong local actor who has legitimacy in that area and who has been effective, or who was effective. And then they said, okay, this is the gold mine. We will basically just push you and empower you in order to go and do the same elsewhere. And that was the wrong mistakes. The model is good to work with local actors, but you cannot work with the same actor everywhere. And this is where they could have improved it.
And they focused on actors only, and that's problematic.
Yeah, this is
so had they focused on discourse, had they focused on the grievances, that could have solved many issues.
And they alienated a lot of their NATO allies as well.
Some.
Some, but not a lot. Yeah, you're right.
Thank you. At the risk of getting overly technical, I just wanted to comment a little bit on what Asad was saying about the oil and the important distinction between the Hasaka fields, effectively PYD controlled legacy Syrian Petroleum Company, and the Al Furat Deir ez-Zor fields. I think if you check that the Swedia crude up north is heavy, high sulfur crude, which is quite difficult to deal with and has traditionally been either put through the refineries or exported into the basin. Whereas the Al Furat Deir ez-Zor crude is typically quite high quality, light, and low sulfur, and in a way easier to refine. So that's an important distinction to make. The other one, of course, is, and I kind of have a question more here, is that it seems to me it would be an easier way of dealing with the northern Hasaka crude to have some agreement between the forces there, the PYD and the Syrian government, which of course is present already in that area. But of course that would depend on the status of the pipeline going past Raqqa, and that again, I'm not sure what the status of that is. That pipeline, if that could be refitted, if the fields could be rehabilitated, we don't really know what state they're in, that could be a resource, and clearly a resource which the people in Hasaka would want to have more of the benefits accruing to them than was typically the case in the past. So that would be a negotiation, and I assume there's something about that. On the Deir ez-Zor area, it looks to me a much more opportunistic issue. You've got 40 or so fields there. The Conoco plant you mentioned is associated gas, but it can only function to full capacity if the 20 fields feeding it are also working at full capacity, and it appears from everything that we know that those fields are not in good shape. There could be an opportunistic advantage, say, for a militia from Hama or from the coast in alliance with some Russians to go and grab a field or two and maybe get 5,000 barrels a day or something that they could truck around, which I suspect is what was at play in this recent incident. So I just wanted to clarify a few of those points. Thanks.
Comment, please. Yeah.
If I may comment very, very quickly, you're absolutely right. So Swedi is lighter. Swedi is heavier than the Deir ez-Zor crude. However, Deir ez-Zor crude is more sour. So there's a sourness and a heaviness issue. But in general, Swedi is the benchmark. Well, because it was the first crude produced from Syria, it's the benchmark crude for Syria, generally referred to as Swedi crude. And when you're trying to price Syrian crude, you just price it off Swedi crude. That has been the general practice at the Petroleum Marketing Department within the Ministry of, the Prime Ministry office at the central government in Damascus. Now, the deals between PYD and the regime for the Swedi crude already exist. Exactly. The pipeline is there, and let's not forget the fields. I didn't talk about them because they were not the subject, but we still have the Rasafa fields, and the Rasafa fields, which were the Gulf Sands, which was the Gulf Sands project, the Rami Makhlouf project, basically. They're there, they're under control of the regime, and they're starting to be rehabilitated, and there's some production coming out of them. It's definitely in the best interest of the PYD at the moment to keep those deals with the regime, unless a different market with a better opportunity is created. And that's what I was trying to argue for, basically, is with the leverage that the international coalition might have, whether on the Iraqi government or on the Turkish government, they can create alternative markets for that crude to be exported to. Or they can even, I mean, I'm thinking very long term here, make a small investment in a small refinery in that area and refine that crude there and not having to send it to Banyas or to Tartus. On the Conoco gas plant, I mean, I worked for ConocoPhillips for 15 years. I started my career on that gas plant, so I'm fully aware of that it's reliant on the Omar and the Tabi'a fields. And if they're not obviously reopened, and you're not going to be able to produce any of the gas. But even if they were reopened, there is no place to take that gas but to the national grid line. So there is no opportunity for leverage there in terms of what to do with that gas.
Please.
Thank you, Emil Hikaim from the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Thank you for your description of local dynamics across those areas, but I want to push you a bit more and ask you to speculate about what would happen to all these communities that you're talking about, whether it's PYD, Kurds, Arabs, across this vast area, if there is a sudden or gradual change in U.S. posture in this in this region. Right now, we're assuming that whatever Rex Tillerson announced, and we're taking U.S. policy very seriously on that. It's very possible that within a near to medium term, there might be changes in U.S. thinking. Is this region, as it is right now, managed largely by the PYD and so on, likely to survive? What are the tactical and strategic calculations of the various actors there? Would they look for different arrangements, possibly with the regime? Would they compete against each other in the prospect of making a deal with the regime at a future stage? I mean, I think there's a lot of uncertainty yet for Eastern Syria. I mean, a lot of the discussion right now almost posits that this is Eastern Syria is going to look like that for the next 10, 15 years. I'm quite skeptical about this. So I would like to know from your own understanding of local and ground dynamics, how the actors would position themselves if the Americans were to rethink their whole posture there. Thank you.
So who's going to tell us what happens if we can no longer rest on the American presence?
From a resource perspective, at least, you will immediately jump to the regime. That's the natural market for you. That's where everything connects to. And that's where most of the influences and most of the technical knowledge is. Today, to repair any of those dams, you need the engineers from Damascus. To rehabilitate any of these pipelines, you need the engineers from Damascus. The people who are operating, whether the Deir ez-Zor fields or the Swediye, the Ermelan fields, are the old people of Al Furat Petroleum Company and Deir ez-Zor Petroleum Company, so on and so forth. So everything makes sense for it to reintegrate within the regime world. But that's purely from a resource perspective.
Looking at Afrin, for instance, and again, same scenario. Turkey pushed the PYD towards the regime. So I see a very similar scenario, actually, with them.
Yeah.
And even if it didn't change totally, by the way, there will be areas that will actually seem to be increased control for the regime. So, yeah.
Well, I think Afrin will be a good example to use in order to first to look at and then imagine what might happen in those areas. But I think it's a bit more complicated than Afrin for two different reasons. The first one, we're assuming that the Americans are leaving and they will not be basically say, we have nothing to do with this. So you're on your own, we're out. If we take the Americans out of the equation, you still have the main actors there, mainly regional and international, are Iran, Russia, regime, and Turkey. And if you look at what's happening in Afrin right now, at least Iran, Russia, and the regime are not on the same page. They are like, although the goal is to give that area back to the regime, the tactics used for that, some of them are basically focusing on what will happen now, others are playing a longer game. I will just talk about this and then go back to there because it's quite relevant. The important thing is that, for example, when we look at Afrin, before the Turks were allowed to enter, the Russians met with Kurdish officials and told them, you have to give the regime full authority over Afrin, and you have to give away the heavy weaponry you have. On top of that, you have to give away the military bases you have in that area. The Kurdish officials said, we will not do that. And then the Russians said, okay, you're on your own, Turks come enter. And they got out. This is when the Kurds started negotiating directly with the regime, not with the Russians, which was the case before. And they were like, okay, we have basically shared interests here, which is to keep the Turks from advancing. And you need to do that now rather than later, because as soon as they capture areas there, it will be difficult to push them out of that area. So instead of basically going for the model that the Russians were trying to implement there, which is a take it or leave it deal, here what the regime is doing is that, okay, I'll just go there now, deal with whatever is available and offered, and then gradually increase my influence and stuff in order to stop the Turks from advancing as soon as possible. So for the regime, it's more like time sensitive than the Russians. And this is why they are going against each other there. And at the end, the Russians, they said, I'm not happy with this deal, and you are not allowed to go there officially. And this is why at the end, they send pro-regime militias that are backed by Iran. And the regime, again here, I think, this is my personal assessment, is that he's again playing the Iranians again. The Russians are like, it's not us, it's them. Go talk to them, I'm fine with you. And this is why I didn't send the military there. So just to highlight that, interdynamics within the same regime alliance or camp here. If you go to Turkey, or to go to that area, for sure, Turkey will try, most likely, to at least capture the border areas in order to secure the area and then prevent the Kurds from establishing their authority there. But also, they have, in order to do that, they have to negotiate with the Russians, because the Russians will be the ones who will replace the no-fly zone imposed by the Americans there. So here, again, we have to see what are the interdynamics between the regime, the Russians, and the Iranians on that area. So based on those agreements, and based on the agreements that take place between them and Turkey, we will start basically having a clearer picture about what might happen there. But if you want to put it in just simple words, for sure, they will try to find a way in order to have a cooperation with the regime, but what they want at the same time is to keep some kind of influence over that area. But will they be able to do that? They were not able to do that in Afrin. So I'm not sure that, especially if the Americans are out, I'm not sure that they will have leverage. So at some point, they might even go for a military option in order to protect themselves from everyone else. That will be a tough one, but it's a possibility. So we are not talking about only political leads with the regime. At some point, they might say that we are on our own and we have to defend our areas, because there is difference between the Kobani and those areas where they consider this is their base and their stronghold. They will not give up those areas no matter what. And between Raqqa and other areas, Manbij, where there could be some talks there in order to give it up, in order to get something in return, or at least to save some bit of that area. I hate you for that question.
Just one of the many reasons why.
Anyone else?
I think they feel sorry for us.
I think it's caffeine time. It looks like it, and a bit in advance. I'm looking at Lina.
Can I say something quickly? I just remember that I didn't answer the question. What happened with ISIS right now? 1 minute, I swear, or less.
1 minute. Where are they?
Basically, they shifted the model they are implementing. So instead of using what they call conventional warfare, where they have territories and they defend those territories, they have became largely insurgencies that depends on guerrilla warfare, which means hit and run and car bombs and those issues. So we will be most likely continue to see in that area is something similar to what happened in Iraq before they were able to re-emerge. All the car bombs, they will basically become spoilers and depend on car bombs and other hit-and-run operations in order to basically destabilize and recruit as many people as possible.
Good. So several of you, the three of you, already said that. Yeah, I mean, what Hyde is saying, you're just reiterating what both of you said before, which is they don't really disappear, and the potential for them to come back unless everyone who's involved does something very serious to contain, demobilize, and reintegrate them. Unless we do this, the potential for a return is very, very high.
And then deal with the root causes of the problem, because this is one important issue.
Lena.
Yes, just a follow-up, because here at Chatham House we are also working on Iraq, and we're looking at ISIS in Iraq. And one of the findings so far is that ISIS in Iraq has also not gone away. It has transformed, not just into insurgencies, but also into almost like a mafia system, engaging in all kinds of economic activities, preparing for when the time comes for it to come back as a military entity. The smuggling networks controlled by ISIS in Iraq are now controlled by new patrons, essentially the popular mobilization forces that are controlled by Iran. So we are seeing the informal economy almost intact, just with different patrons at the top. And ISIS, as I said, moving on to do all kinds of business activities. So the business dimension seems to me very important in looking at the future of these militias, because they put on many hats, and not all of these hats are military. And it seems to me that also the economic networks between Iraq and Syria are still there, and this explains partly why Iran has been so keen to play a role in the northeast in Syria, because the PMFs, the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq, are also kind of, looking east and have said on a number of occasions that they are interested in participating in the liberation of these areas in Syria from ISIS. So, of course, it's not just about defeating ISIS. It's actually an excuse for these militias to link up and profit economically. So my question is to any of you who can answer, because this has not come up in the panel, and I think it should, which is the Iranian presence in the northeast. In Deir ez-Zor in particular, what is happening on the ground? We have published a piece on the Syria from Within website about this, but I think it's very important to raise this issue. So anyone who wants to comment?
Well, I'll try to venture and then hand over to Hayed when I give up. Basically, I think the main representative of Iranian influence in Deir ez-Zor is Sheikh Nawaf al-Bashir and the Baggara tribe. And they're basically leading the local militia there. But let's not forget that Nawaf al-Bashir lost one or two of his sons just 2 to 3 weeks ago. That was a big, at the Wagner incident, at the incident where the Russians basically tried to cross the border. Just to explain a bit the Wagner incident, the president of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, issued a decree awarding 25% to any mercenary who's willing to take an oil to basically take over a field. So a lot of those now mercenaries are very interested in trying to venture out and try to take some of these fields because they'll get 25% royalty. And that basically was the driver behind the Wagner incident, along Nawaf al-Bashir and his crew. This has created an immense reaction within the Baggara tribe itself, where I don't see how aligned they are at the moment with 100% Iranian policy anymore. And there's a lot of free thinking happening in terms of how they want to present themselves because of the amount of local pressure that is being put on them. That's one. You have as well a lot of the Iraqi militias that are deployed along the border, basically within regime control. And I mean, it's the whole lot. Fatimiyun, Zainabiyun, I can go on and on. Abu al-Fadl Abbas, I mean, we can go on and on with the 93, I think now, different militias fighting for the Syrian regime. So they're all there, they're all present. And the main base for them is the airport that was hit by the Israelis, again 3 weeks ago. It's not Shaitat, it's
T4.
the T4 airport. Basically, that was the main Iranian base in that area. That was hit and completely destroyed by the Israeli Air Force. So the dynamics there as well will involve Israel, and that's why I tried to throw the Israeli question at the end in terms of, well, how would Israel react to reinforcements of Iranian presence, even at the east, I mean along that east presence? Because every time, and my prediction is every time we're going to see an incident in Daraa, Israel's reaction is not going to be in Daraa. Israel's reaction is going to be in Deir ez-Zor. And we're going to see more and more attacks in that area, basically to stop that influence and push it and contain it going forward. Hence, as well, their new strategy of arming 7 different FSA brigades in the south to push Daesh out of the Yarmouk basin and take that area back.
Yeah, let me start with what you ended with. I don't think that the Israelis will go and strike in Deir ez-Zor, because according to what they have been saying publicly and what they have been doing on the ground is that that's true. They are not limiting their actions to Daraa, but they're hitting the areas that are close to that region, and there are basically military bases, factories, and stuff like that. So the Iranians so far don't have similar establishments, let's put it this way, in Deir ez-Zor. And this is why I'm not sure that they will go that far, at least for now, because there is no strategic locations in order to go and hit them. They are not interested in hitting few hundred people here and there. They are precise and they go for strategic locations, and they don't have those issues in Deir ez-Zor. So I'm not sure that they go that far unless things change. To start with the new financial model you talked about, I totally agree, and I wrote a piece for Chatham House on how ISIS financial basically model in Syria is also changing. It didn't change to the same extent as in Iraq, because in Iraq they're Iraqis and they're more advanced and they're more established. But they're trying to basically keep up with what's happening there and implement the same model inside Syria. And they've been successful in achieving that. And this is why it's important. This is important for the sustainability of their operations inside Syria. And what Lena was referring to is basically going for financing third parties who are legitimate actors, who are going for businesses like second-hand cars, the currency exchange places, all those jobs that are quite difficult to keep an eye on and then be able to show, okay, who's giving you the money, where the money is going to, blah, blah, blah. So they are doing the same, and this is quite important. The other issue, why this is important, because it would be difficult for the international community to say, okay, we will cut all the money that is going into Syria and Iraq, and we will dry them out. But that will not happen, because they already have basically enough sources inside those two countries. When it comes to what Iran is doing in Deir ez-Zor, it's still difficult to understand, because they are now trying to establish their networks and everything. But as Muhammad Hassan, who's the one who wrote the piece, I would for sure ask everyone to read it. I don't remember the title, but it's really, really informative. They are trying to do two main issues. The first one is the religious dimension, which is to try to pay people in order to convert, to become Shia. And this is not limited to that area. I remember in my hometown, in the countryside of Aleppo, in 2003 and 4, they were doing the same there. But they know that this will not take them far, because many of those people who are getting that money and they become Shia, they know that they are just doing that for money and for the help they're getting, so they cannot depend on that. But they will do that anyway to make it part of the culture, and they say that, okay, we have something there. They
And
have
it
to.
makes a difference in the census as well.
Exactly.
After a few years, when you do a population census.
It does, but not, at least in my hometown, it didn't. Like if I look at what they did in the 10 past years before the revolution started, it didn't really have much influence over the. Yeah, but let me just finish this. So it didn't have much influence, but because everything is changing right now, so that doesn't mean that it will be the same for sure. But they are depending, which is quite important, they are depending on 2 small villages, Shia villages in that region, and they're basically mobilizing those villages in order to do those activities. On top of that, they are trying to create local militias. Some of them are Shia, but we're talking about 2 villages, so they are not much. And this is where they are trying to basically benefit from the differences and conflicts between local actors and tribes here in particular, because there are few tribes that are considered pro-ISIS, or at least some members from those tribes went to ISIS and joined. And this is why you see, especially in Deir ez-Zor, some tribes are trying to attack, Shaitats attacking some of the tribes who were traditionally aligned with ISIS. And this is a big opportunity for Iran in order to arm one tribe or more than one tribe and actors and play on local dynamics in order to have their own allies there. And because that area is traditionally and historically neglected for years and years, they know that this area no one will look into. So this is a gold mine for them. They have a foothold there, and they will continue to basically increase their influence there, and on these 2 levels. And this is the same model that is being implemented elsewhere as well. And if we just quickly say what Iran, the end game for Iran in Syria, in my understanding, it's a bit similar to what they did in Lebanon and Iraq. Weak state, strong non-state actors who have veto over what the state is doing. And the problem is that even if you look at what they did in Iraq, the model is completely different to what they did in Lebanon. In Lebanon, one strong party, Hezbollah. In Iraq, it's a network of small groups. So the one big group in Syria will not be possible because we don't have they don't have sizable Shia community there, so they cannot depend on that model. So it seems that they are going for the other model, network of basically small groups here and there who are allied with or aligned with Iran in order to create some kind of networks, business opportunities, and there are other issues that I'm sure you're more equipped than me to talk about. That basically the investments that they are trying to put not only in Damascus, the city, but in in the border, the Shia villages on the Syrian side of the border. They have long-term vision and they are going for it. And hopefully they will not be able to achieve it, but I'm not sure that there is anyone who's trying to stop them.
Did anyone on this side had a burning last point to make?
You have 5 minutes, guys.
Yeah.
Just quickly on the tribal issue and also what Iran has been able to do in terms of recruitment. So when we speak of Baqara, we have to remember the fact that a large part of it is actually with the SDF. Right. Yasser Fayyad, who is one of the most brilliant local army officers that was responsible for liberating the Khabur Valley, is a Baqara. And the Baqara youth was FSA, then was Syrian elite forces with Ahmed al-Jarba. And then when they saw that this was not going nowhere, they joined the SDF. So the Baqara part of the tribe that have swear allegiance to the Iranians are the part that are inhabiting southern Aleppo. This goes into different dynamics. There was the Barris, there was the Shabihas. So it's a very long, history. There's also a strong relationship with Hezbollah, and there need to be a distinction made at this point between Hezbollah and the IRGC. Hezbollah think of himself more and more as a separate or head-to-head entity with IGC, not as a subordinate as it used to be before. And last point on Deir ez-Zor tribal scene, the same tribes have a lot of families in Iraq, and they have just shared the grievances of the Shia-Sunni fight in Iraq. I would think it will be extremely difficult for Iran to recruit in Deir ez-Zor itself. In Hasakeh, maybe. In Deir ez-Zor, not so much.
Just to comment on this, the role of tribes.
30 seconds.
30 seconds, I promise you. I lie.
I know.
The role of tribes, I will quickly highlight that people, when they talk about Eastern Syria, they say that, okay, what do we know about Eastern Syria? It's a tribal area. That means that tribes are important, are strong, and we will deal with them as political actors. But what they don't take into consideration, is the fact that those tribes, they are not political actors anymore. If you look at the way the regime was dealing with them, is that have intermediaries within the tribes who will be able to, because of their connection to the regime, will be able to sort out some issues and then basically become the key, they call it miftah in Syria, which is the contact person. But if you look at the tribes, they are divided on so many levels. You have some of them who joined or are still pro-Assad. You have some of them who are still pro-Free Syrian Army. You have some of them who are I'm talking about the same tribe, huh? Some of them are pro-Nusra, some of them are pro-ISIS, and then some of them are pro-SDF right now. So you have, it's divided, the loyalty of those individuals from the same tribe are basically divided according to the people they follow. They don't follow the same, basically, leader, and they don't always agree on who they should support. At the same time, you have the generation, basically, differences and arguments between the old and the young, and this is why every single actor who has been trying to manipulate them and play them against each other, and they will always say that we have enough tribal support in those areas, but they handpick those who accept them and then empower them enough in order to say those are the leaders.
So it takes us back to the morning sessions, which is great because then this whole day is coming together really nicely about the who are the influential actors in any community, how much of a blanket statement can we throw on a village, a community, a city, a tribe, a religion, an ethnic group in Syria, and maybe to look at the conflict in Syria not anymore through this lens, which is a lens that unfortunately has been the easier one to keep, to draw conclusions and draw dichotomies. And in reality, it's more about intersections than dichotomies. This is what the conflict is teaching us. Thank you so much for bearing with us. We can now break for half an hour and come back at 3:30.